may I invite on stage Mr. Reji John, editor, Indian Transport and Logistic News, please, to be our honored moderator for this great session up on stage. To join Reji, may invite Mr. Sreenivas Rao Nandigam, Global Head of Supply Chain, Sun Pharma, who is going to be in conversation with Mr. Reji John.
Sreenivas Rao, it's a great pleasure to have you. Like the MC announced, Rao is the Global Head of Supply Chain, Sun Pharma. One of the many success stories of Indian pharmaceutical manufacturing in India, a publicly listed Indian multinational company. What was started in 1983 by a gentleman called Dilip Shangvi with 5 psychiatry products and a 2-person marketing team from its manufacturing facility for tablets and capsules at Vapi in Gujarat. Mr. Shangvi continues to lead the company, and Sun Pharma today generates about $5.4 billion in revenue. It is the 4th largest generic pharmaceutical company worldwide. I'm sure these are numbers and statistics will keep changing. Probably, if I'm wrong, Rao will correct me in the course of next 20 minutes. Rao has 16 years worked with Unilever, 9 years with Reckitt Benckiser, and the last 7 years Sun Pharma. That's 3 companies in the 30 plus years in supply chain. He's a mechanical engineer from IIT Kanpur. And what probably some of you may not know is, and that's what I want Rao to tell the story about making bar soaps before college. And we started to hear about ChatGPT, AI, and all that thing quite recently. But he was a man who started robotics and played with those tools, artificial intelligence, in the early 90s. Tell us those stories, Mr. Rao.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to kind of meet the supply chain folks from the industry, from the service providers, and various people. Yeah, and it's a very, very interesting story. I mean, I was not prepared for this particular question, but I must say that
I have to keep some surprises always.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting story, and as you rightly said, that after my engineering, I had this fascination for doing something in robotics because that was something which was very fascinating back in those days. And what you say is right. Back in those days, in 1991, I did some courses on artificial intelligence and robotics and so on and so forth. And it was my fascination. But having satiated my need for those fascination, and I don't know where you picked up all this particular experiences and bar soaps and artificial intelligence and so on and so forth.
I'm a journalist, so I sniff for sniff for news.
I'm sure, not about the public information, but I have nothing to correct about my private information. I must say that. Yeah. So after having satiated my interest on robotics and artificial intelligence, I had to get down to brass tacks, which is what happens in a normal campus interviews position. And I got selected in Unilever as a management trainee. For those days, back in those days, it was not even supply chain. It was called manufacturing and
godown management.
Yes. And I mean, then the story continued to actually have worked for Unilever across various factories in the back of beyond places across various parts of the country. And, some small stints in Singapore and London. Yeah.
Okay, tell us about those 25 years with 2 global companies, Unilever, Reckitt Benckiser. How did you take those learnings of supply chain into a pharmaceutical company in the last 9 years, Sun Pharma, and we have seen the growth of Sun Pharma over the last 30 years?
Yeah, so I think supply chain as a word was perhaps coined, if I recollect, not too long ago, about 40 years ago, by Keith Oliver in 1982, if I recollect. Yeah. And when I joined to, start my career, I didn't even know that supply chain was a word which was already coined, because I joined in 92, about 10 years after the word was coined. But around in mid-90s, I started to kind of learn this particular thing, about supply chain, and supply chain encompassed everything in consumer industry. Right? Plan, make, source, and deliver. all the four baskets was included as a part of the supply chain. Unlike, let's say, in either companies like, let's say, core industries like cement, steel, etc., where operations, which is factory operations, is not a part of the supply chain because they're very, very heavy in terms of operations. Similarly, in pharmaceutical, operations is something which is very specifically carved out because it's very heavy from a compliance perspective. Yeah. And you need people with some level of expertise and some level of passion to kind of do that. Now, when I moved into Sun after my experience in 25 years in consumer goods industry, as they say that necessity is the mother of invention. Consumer goods are a very high volume, but not so high margin companies. Yeah, typical gross margins would be sub 50s, and EBITDA percentages would be like between 15 and 20%. If you come to pharmaceutical world, our world have got higher gross margins and higher EBITDAs as a total percentage of the top line. And consequently, our types of inventory management, what we do, our technologies which we use are slightly different. So in the last, let's say, 10 odd years, when the generic pharma industry started getting under pressure in terms of margins and so on and so forth, that's when a lot of industry people thought of going outside of industry to actually recruit people from either the consumer industry or the core sector, because they are the industries which have to operate at a higher level of efficiency by the very fact that it is the need. Yeah, just to quote an example, people from cement industry, they have a logistics expenses of about 17 to 18% of their top line. They can't afford to fly more than 250 kilometers or 300 kilometers for their particular product. In the case of pharma, we can afford to kind of send them across continents, and that too by air. Yeah. So industry has actually started adopting on the periphery, and supply chain, I would call it as on the periphery, not in the core, not in the R&D, not in the manufacturing. Some companies like Reddy's, etc., have actually taken people from outside of the industry into the core as well. But a lot of the industry has actually taken people on the periphery to bring it from outside. So what is it that my experience has been? Very interesting. In the last 7 odd years, a lot of efficiency improvement programs, which have actually led to huge amount of visibility and wastage reduction. Okay. I don't know if I've answered the specific question, but I can go in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I think I'll come to some of the very specifics. A bit curious, if you were get an opportunity, would you go back to consumer industry, or like you are like stick with you would want to be?
I would perhaps not want to go back to consumer industry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rao, what are some of the biggest trends that you are observing in this global supply chains for pharmaceutical healthcare industry? So top of your mind.
Yeah. So top of my mind, I would say about 10 years ago, when the industry started coming under pressure, people were talking about efficiencies, inventory improvement, and so on and so forth. Post-COVID, I'm actually seen a lot of people talking about shifting from the strategy of, let's say, trying to reduce inventory and being just in time to actually creating backups for just in case. Yeah. Because what has happened is that, the uncertainty level in the world has actually increased in the last 4 years, 5 years, I would say. And it's not just because of COVID, because of geopolitical, because of Red Sea, because of Israel war, because of what variety of things. Yeah. So people have said that we want to kind of create a backup and look at situation not just in time, but also just in case. That's one of the big shifts which I have seen. Yeah. And therefore creating an alternate vendor base, creating if you're talking about, let's say, logistics service providers, not necessarily going to the lowest cost service providers, but going towards a service provider who is more reliable, quality conscious, and so on and so forth. That's one big trend. The other big trend, which I see specifically more so within India, is, and that too for exports also, is that the regulators have become a lot more stringent. Yeah, at this point in time, you see only on the manufacturing side, but they have also started to tighten the screws on the distribution side. Yeah, the temperature excursions which we see, the the kappas which we generate. Now, some of the regulators have started to actually look at the kappas in the logistics space as well, which was never heard of earlier. Okay, so the two large trends which I see: uncertainty leading to creating backups. Number one. Number two, compliance levels have increased a lot in the last 5 to 7 years. That's evident from the public news, both in terms of manufacturing sites as well as in the distribution space. And therefore, as a result of that, service providers need to be far more reliable and reliant.
Okay. Disruptions, uncertainties on the rise. Like I said, I mentioned this in one of the earlier discussions. The rate and the frequency at which disruptions happen is like, it's quite alarming. And how do you plan? You have to have not only plan B, but probably plan C and plan D.
Yeah.
Where do you see the consumer demand, meeting consumer demand in such a scenario? Basically, at the end of the day, customer centricity, consumers at the center of what you want to deliver. Where do you see customer centricity in all of this?
There are two types of worlds within pharmaceutical. One is the developed world, other is the developing world. The developed world have got very large customers. The McKessons of the world, the Cardinal, ABC, and the Red Oaks, yeah, and some of the tenders in the Western world. The developing world, where there is a distributed trade, pharmaceutical, these are the small distributors. So these are the customers. If the question is about customer centricity,
yeah,
and these are the customers, and consumers are patients in our case, yeah, and so patient centricity I will not talk about. Let me talk about the customer centricity to start with. The customers have started to demand more from the manufacturers. Okay. But also on the flip side, the shortages of drugs have also increased because of the answer which I gave you in the previous question, which is basically tightening of the screws on the regulatory aspect and the quality aspect. The supply shortages have increased, and therefore the shortages of drugs have increased, and therefore we are able to kind of demand more from the customers. But in terms of uncertainty, the way to deal with is, in my opinion, start asking for what the projections are from the large customers. Okay, which means all the big customers, they have a supply chain department of themselves. They are doing a forecasting of their stuff, which if they are able to give it to us a 6 months forward forecast, we will have some level of planning in terms of what to procure, what to keep at which echelon, inventories, and so on and so forth. So that's a way to deal with the large customers. With the small customers, I heard somewhere in the last panel saying that 40% of the sale happens in the last 2 days. Yeah, that's one big change which we have made in Sun Pharma in the last 6 to 8 months. And believe me or not, we have almost equal amount of sale happening in week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4 in this country, in India. Okay. A lot of the distribution managers who would be sitting here would be taking my words with a pinch of salt, if not with a fistful of salt. But trust me, this is a behavior change which we are bringing in the distributors and in the trade community. Yeah. Being the largest company, perhaps we could actually force some of the things down the throats of the people. But after 6 to 8 months of actually having adopted a lot of things in the industry, I can tell you, and I have interacted with a lot of distributors, the distributor trade, a lot of them are very happy.
Would you like to reveal that strategy as to how you managed to change that mindset, or how you managed to do that in the last 8 months?
It's a very long journey, honestly. The first thing which we need to talk about is, again, being customer centric. While what is in it for me is one part of the story, I need to go and do a lot of marketing job in terms of what is in it for the distributors. Okay, because if there is a smooth flow of goods for the distributors, the amount of space which the distributor requires is actually narrowed down. Instead of keeping the space for the peak requirement at the month end, he needs to keep a very constant space. And there are multiple things, multiple benefits which we need to highlight. In the first go, it's a rejection. slow acceptance. It has taken about 8 months for us to kind of get there.
You talked about responding to customer demands.
Yeah.
But what is your expectation from your logistics service providers? What is your demand? What is your ask from them? And that's what we are talking about here. There are quite a lot of them here.
I know. And, as an industry also, we haven't been so good in terms of actually asking them for longer term contracts and so on and so forth. Yeah. What I would expect my customers to push back the manufacturers is, instead of doing a spot buying, can we enter into a longer term contracts of 6 months, 1 year? Because there are carriers sitting here, there are freight forwarders who are sitting here, and carriers would love to actually get into a, let's say, a standard to fill their base demand basis their cost plus. We would also, as manufacturer, we are not here for actually a 1 year or a 2 year business. We are here for a lifetime business. And I would like to kind of do more longer term contracting with all the service providers than a spot contracting. That's one of my key asks.
Let's talk about technology and digital tools and how those tools are actually improving global supply chains in the healthcare industry. And if you can highlight one or two specific applications of digital tools, technology solutions in supply chain functions, supply chain operations in Sun Pharma.
I may want to restrict myself outside of Sun Pharma, but I can talk about the industry in general. Industry in general, as I said, is a little bit of a laggard from a perspective of adopting technology. And when I say laggard, and rightfully so, because we deal with the lives of the people. Yeah. And we would not like to kind of be the guinea pig of experimentation, because it impacts our patients at the end of the day. Yeah. You might say, what is the big deal in terms of applying it in, let's say, logistics and service providers, etc. But it is there. Initially, when I joined the company, it took me 9 months for actually creating a direct lane shipment for bypassing one more leg. But I now realize that, it's not perhaps the right thing to kind of take a knee-jerk reaction. Yeah. So having said that, what are those things which advanced planning tools? Yeah. Concurrent planning, end-to-end planning is something which impacts us a lot in terms of giving visibility starting from our raw material purchases till the end customer. That's one big thing. Specifically, when I talk about the US demand and European demand, it's such a lumpy demand that one customer goes away, 30% of my actually demand vanishes. And that's a big problem for me, because I have procured raw materials and there are some raw materials in the pipeline to come. All of them are not required for me, or vice versa. Okay. So therefore, end-to-end visibility tools give us a very good, I would say, advantage in terms of running the supply chain as smoothly as possible. And I don't want to name them, but there are dime a dozen in the industry, and many of them have implemented. We are also implementing one of them as we speak.
With so much of information available, data available, and access to high power computing, we're still struggling with predicting the demand on a reasonable level of accuracy. How do we change that, and when does that happen?
Very interesting question. And I keep giving this example that, the weatherman can predict weather perhaps far more accurately than we can predict our demand with our customers. Yeah. Having said that, there are pockets. For example, when you talk about a lumpy demand, yeah, the lumpy demand, it's not easy to project demand accuracy. But when it talk about, let's say, a branded business, like for example in India is a branded generic business, and the forecast accuracies are upwards of 80-85%. In some of the months it goes all the way up to 87% also. Yeah. Similarly, the branded business which we have of Sun Pharmaceuticals, which we keep boasting of, we have an 85% accuracy. There are complex tools which we use, but the biggest sensing there is about the number of prescriptions, the amount of conversions which are happening, and so on and so forth. Where the problem is in terms of generic, because that's a commodity business. And in commodity business, it's not very easy to kind of predict the demand. Having said that, there's one tool which is available today where we could do a little bit of a prediction of the demand, especially when it comes to the shortages or excesses, which is basically with TraceLink. All the serialization data is available with TraceLink, and they have visibility at a clustered level of inventories going up and coming down. And that could be a very big demand sensing tool, which we can use for commodities also.
Logistic and supply chain, do they get due importance and credit at the high table in your organization, or generally, particularly after COVID? How does your MD and founder approach supply chains?
I must say that I have been more fortunate than others to be having a center stage, in the boardroom, not just in Sun Pharma, but also whether it was in Reckitt or in Unilever. It always had a boardroom seat, and I must say that I was fortunate to work in companies where supply chain was regarded very well. And as you rightly said, post COVID, everybody has realized, even consumer goods companies, they didn't know how many suppliers, how many factories, and so on. Everybody now knows it. So, to answer your question, indeed, we get a lot of importance, especially after COVID. Even before COVID, I was more lucky. Let me put it this way.
I'll take one question from the audience if there is one. But Rao, what according to you is the future of supply chain or supply chain of tomorrow for the pharmaceutical industry?
I have worked in, when I say supply chain, manufacturing and supply chain both. What I love to do is to have a no-touch factory, a factory with one man and one dog. Okay, the dog is supposed to actually make sure that nobody enters the factory. And what is the man expected to do? Any answers?
What's the dog?
Watch the dog and take care of the dog. Similarly, in supply chains, no-touch supply chains are extremely important. And we have examples in this world. Amazon, for example, is a no-touch supply chain. It's a living example. Now, can we get there? Do we want to get there? Maybe not. But at least we should actually start thinking of our journey towards that direction of no-touch. That's my future.
Okay, thanks. Rao, I'd like to end the conversation. If you can pick up one or two key milestones from your career of 33, 34 years in supply chain.
So I wouldn't say one or two milestones, but one milestone is one key learning, which I would say is that, I used to run factories, as I said. I used to run a cluster of factories, and as I said, fortunate enough to kind of become, at a very young age, to run a lot of factories together. At the age of 35, I was having 10 factories and 20 CMOs and so on and so forth. But then I very quickly learned that influencing is a very important part of the role for me to learn. And I relinquished my responsibility of running a line factory and actually moved into the center, which gave me a lot of learning. That was one of the turning points for me to kind of say that it is not necessary for you to be able to kind of run an organization with people reporting into you only. Your ability to influence people is very large. Today, for example, take the case of my boss, Mr. Dilip Sangvi. I mean, it's easy for him to kind of give directions to us and instructions to us. But his job is not about that. His job is about actually managing the stakeholders and shareholders who do not report into him and influence that at large. So that's one key learning for me and one milestone where I felt that influencing is a very important part of people in supply chain.
Thanks, Sreenivas Rao. Friends, put your hands together for Sreenivas Rao, Global Head of Supply Chain, Sun Pharma. Thank you so much.